Week 7, Path and Lab for CPT coding. Just a quick video going through the chapter. So if you want to open up your textbooks, start with the first page of chapter 4. First of all, what I want to show you is the heading here talks about the super bill or requisition form. I have this, it's called Picture of Lab Order Form, in your content for you. This is a scanned image, so it's not the greatest, I understand, I'm going to move myself here. There you go. So you can see this was our regional lab radiology order form from Gunderson out of La Crosse. And you can see what our lab form looked like. Now you also can look at page 141 and see a copy of the lab order form that the textbook provides for us. Tests are often requested by means of a super bill or requisition form, as illustrated there on page 141 and here on your screen as well. You can see that I have some notes here. The BNPNT is CPT code 82847, or it was back then when I used it. It was $163.20, and it standard for brain natriuretic something something peptide. And I just made that little note for myself. Once I looked it up once, I wouldn't have to again. You can see a lot of the lab tests here. Okay, calcium. Here's the code for it. There's also a column here for diagnosis. Not that there's room to put a diagnosis in there, correct? But when you come down here to the bottom, there was a box where the doctor would list diagnosis number 1 and put it in there. Diagnosis number 2 and put it in there. 3, put it in there, list as many as we needed. And then he or she linked them. So if the patient was having, a potassium test right here for their hypertension, we did sodium, potassium, BUN, I think, were always ones that were ordered for hypertension. For their labs, just to make sure their levels were okay before they gave them more medicine, or they re-prescribed their medicine for them. So say potassium was for hypertension. We would put a 1 here for potassium, and number 1, it would be hypertension. Okay. So all of these were linked for us. It's very, very important. I want to make sure the textbook, it doesn't go into too much detail with it. I want to make sure that we understand we have medical necessity. And that's proving medical necessity right there. Okay, linking your diagnosis code to what lab you're ordering for. Maybe it's screening. Okay, maybe you don't really have, maybe it's a screening cholesterol test. That's fine. You still need to write in screening. The only difference with my screen here and what you can see on page 141 is I also have some x-rays here that we did at our clinic. Now, of course, these are the most common, obviously, right? We have way more CPT codes for lab tests than what is here on the screen. But these were the most common ones that we did. And that also space was used down here to write in something that they couldn't find, okay? And you can see that we had, from the radiology chapter, some of our codes here for radiology. If you are looking at page 141, and also page 140, I think what's important is where it's highlighted and kind of bold termed here on page 140 in the second column there. It says the services in the path and lab section from your CPT manual include the lab test only. The collection of the specimen is coded separately. For example, if a patient had a technician in a clinic lab withdraw blood by means of venipuncture, and the blood sample was analyzed, sent to the lab, the code 36415 is reported for the venipuncture, in addition to the code to report the test performed on the blood. So in the example that I gave you here, where we did a potassium, and it was for hypertension, we also, see right above here, billed the venipuncture, the 36415. It would be circled. The lab tech would circle the labs that they did, or write them in, and also circle the venipuncture every single time. That's one way, and I think it was like $12 back when I was billing it out. It might be 20 something now, but it's one way we can recoup that specialty and help pay for that technician, that lab tech's staff's salary. Okay, So collecting that venipuncture is something that's important. We always will charge that. Now remember, not obviously if we're doing pregnancy test urine, we're not collecting any blood. There's no blood poke, no stick, no nothing. Okay, so we wouldn't bill it out then. It has to be if we're drawing blood for something. So that's very important. And you can see on the lab slip that they gave us in the book, the diagnosis 1, 2, 3, 4, where you can write it in, the spot for write-in tests that don't fall on this page, so that's good. And then also down at the bottom, lab use only, arterial puncture, venipuncture, all of those are really, really good to make sure that we pay attention to. So turn to page 142 in your textbook, moving on here. Organ or disease-oriented panels. I think the biggest deal, there's no difference with this. We don't go in more in depth from when we did an intro to CPT, but just to remind you and review that the bold term there, the sentence there says, to assign a panel code, each test listed in that description has to be performed. Okay? Every single test listed has to be performed. And if you go through and count and you missed the total calcium, there's no result for it. It wasn't done. You cannot bill that panel. You specifically go back and you bill out every single one of those tests separately. The great thing about CPT is they have all the codes there for you. Okay, when you look in your CPT book under some of these panels, that's really, really great. So we don't have to go look them all up separately if, in fact, we did not have that panel. Again, the textbook talks about what I did with the CPT book notes little video was make sure you don't report modifier 52. If they weren't all done, you cannot bill that panel out. You have to split them all out. I have a little note on page 143. It's case 4.1, and they go through and they want you to code some of these. And I wrote down, if you go to the P for panel in the index of your CPT book, it tells you C, blood tests, or organ, so when the O's, organ or disease-oriented panel. So you can find it a couple of different ways. Blood test is a great way to go. Page 144, therapeutic drug assays. I guess what I have highlighted here on my page is the bottom part of that first paragraph. For example, it starts out, if a patient were prescribed phenobarbital for a clonic seizure disorder, the patient's blood ideally would contain a level of phenobarb within a therapeutic range, right? We want it to be in that therapeutic range. Periodically, our doctor is going to have the phenobarb level drawn so we can gauge and see, is the patient taking the medicine as they're supposed to? Are they not? Are they taking it as they're supposed to and it's still not in that therapeutic range, so we need to up it or maybe we need to drop it a little bit? That's how we manage that, okay? So looking at drug monitoring has its own set of codes. It's important, at the top of page 145, it says that the diagnosis and the lab tests correlate to ensure accurate reporting and reimbursement for services provided to that patient. That, of course, is medical necessity right there. Okay, we have to prove medical necessity. We have to have a diagnosis for every single one of these lab tests. And if they're not linked, what do? We query. Go back and ask. Query enough, they're going to get irritated and remember that they should do it the first time. The last paragraph here above the urinalysis section says drugs are listed by their generic or chemical names, not brand names. For example, 80162 is for the generic drug digoxin, sold under the name brands Lanoxin, Parodigen. Okay, there's a bunch of them. So a current copy of the physician's desk reference or drug book is going to be helpful as you report drug assays. Now, we were just using Near Perfect in Health Records Management class the other day and saw the link where you can go right out to the drug reference. Okay, it's right part of the EHR now, as it is in many software systems. So that's awesome for us. The urinalysis section, this is where, I'd like you to stop and watch the urinalysis video that I have linked in the content for you. It's a good one from YouTube. Again, there's a lot of good YouTube videos that we like to watch. Anything from nuclear medical media is really, really good. Or nucleus medical media. They're not blood and guts, so they're animated, but they're really, really good. On page 146, this is where it talks about the occult blood tests, where we put screening and then symptoms on a couple of those codes in the code book, so you can read through that. Nothing too deep or anything, worse there. The timed urine, looking at creatinine clearance, is talked about. 82575, it's a kidney function test. The assessment is conducted on a urine sample that's taken over a period of time. It's usually 24 hours. This is where, the patients will come into the front desk and slam their jug of urine down and say, I'm supposed to bring this back. And we look at them and say, it goes in the lab down the hall. We don't want any of your stuff, on our desks. So timed urine tests, we bill them out once. It's not once for a whole 24. You don't bill it when they take it and bill it when they bring it back. You bill it when they bring it back, because then we actually have that 24-hour amount and can send it in. Chemistry can be a little bit challenging. They say the most challenging in all of CPT because of the technical language used in the code description. So you got to be really, really, really careful when you're talking about some of these codes and getting them, because the codes are very close in definition. Turning to page 150, where we get to the hematology and coagulation heading. In that heading underneath the paragraph there, it says a common lab test is a hemogram. It's a graphic picture of the various blood constituencies. A differential, or a diff, is an actual count of the number of the constituencies. For example, a leukocyte, or white blood cell, WBC, diff, would include all of these. So a listing of the myelocytes, how many lymphs, how many monos, how many eos, how many basals. Okay? So it's a little more in depth, and you can see down here, underneath there then, the doctor would order a WBC, the patient would arrive at the lab, the tech would draw a specimen by venipuncture, the blood would be analyzed, and a report would be sent. For example, a physician who ordered a WC for a patient received the following lab information in the lab report. You can see that there was 2 myelocytes. You can see that that's high. Okay, the H is high, the W is L, the WNL is within normal limits, and the percentage of them. Okay, so that kind of helps you know how to read those. The lab use only is really good to know about on page 150. I kind of had to learn this on my own when I was coding. It said the codes in the path and lab section represent only the test performed, not the drawing of the actual sample like we can for the venipuncture. So the lab use only was used for people that were getting life insurance and had to have some blood drawn. They'd bring the kit. Okay, the patient would bring the kit into the lab and say, I need this done. It's a lot of paperwork spread out. We have to call FedEx or DSL, have them come, pick it up right away and ship it. We didn't do any testing here, but we did a lot of the paperwork and the collecting of it. We can bill a lab use only, kind of a handling fee. And I think it was like $30, and at least it was something to help with all the time that they spent that day. So that's a good code to use every once in a while when you have that kind of situation. Coagulation on the next page. Obviously, this is for people that are taking blood thinners, which is obviously sometimes the most common in the lab when you're coding lab tests. Nothing much with immunology. Obviously, it's looking for antibodies to see if we have developed, that immune system against certain substances and certain diseases, and so we're looking for that. And then basically it talks about other lab services. Going through, I'm just pulling through here and turning pages. Page 161 talks about surgical pathology, and that's the last big section of this chapter. Again, you have to remember there's a code for gross only. Remember, gross is by my eye, and micro is using the microscope. And in the path form, you'll see where it says a gross description, a path, or a micro description, and then what the pathologic diagnosis is, kind of goes in that order. There's usually a really good template on those. So in surgical pathology, is there a gross and micro? Make sure your code reflects gross and micro, okay? Also, I had a note in the other area, or the other video that I did, look at things like the fallopian tubes. They fall under a couple of different levels. These levels are more in depth as you go, so you have to be careful that you're not just picking one and done, that you're looking through to make sure that you really do have the right thing there.
On page 165, you can see they give you a lab requisition form, and the little X's. It's kind of hard to see next